And for our next talk, I'm going to welcome both speakers. Sabine Ochner and Peter Scholl are going to talk about how secure are SPDZ implementations actually, multi-threading, mag checks, and other pitfalls.
Here we go. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So this is joint work with Sabine, as well as my former master's students, Alexander and Frederick. And so in the landscape of MPC research, people often kind of consider these two distinct worlds of theory and practice, where on the one hand, you maybe have theoreticians who are busy thinking about proofs and UC security models and so on, while practitioners, who maybe many of you here at Real World MPC, are more focused on building actual systems for applications, whereas perhaps getting confused by the proofs that the rest of us are writing. So on the one hand, you could view this work as being something that kind of highlights the gap between these two areas, but I think it's also important to think about how to bridge these gaps, and I think we kind of identify an area where there's definitely room for more collaboration and open things that can be solved to help these worlds work together. Okay, so the main focus of our work is studying the actual security of some MPC implementations that are out there and used today. And we focused on the SPDZ protocol, which is an actively secure MPC protocol in the dishonest majority setting, and studied a few different frameworks. And our main result is, I guess, a more theoretical observation that there's an aspect of the SPDZ protocol which is kind of leaky in some sense. And if not implemented carefully, this can easily lead to attacks in settings that exploit multi-threading in concurrency. So we analyzed some frameworks and to identify their susceptibility to this weakness. And along the way, we also pointed out various other issues and implementation bugs that lead to different kinds of attacks. Okay, so let's dive into some technical details. So the SPDZ protocol was originally introduced at Crypto 2012 and then later optimized in 2013. And I'll focus on the 2013 version today because this supports more general reactive computations. SPDZ uses additive secret sharing with information theoretic max over a finite field, where every secret either input or intermediate value in the computation is some field element x, which is additively shared into shares xi distributed among the parties, as well as these shares gamma I of a MAC on x. So the MAC is just some product alpha times x, where alpha is a secret MAC key known to nobody, and the MAC itself is secret shared, so each party gets this share gamma I of the MAC. Okay, so this is a linear secret sharing scheme, which is nice, and the MACs are supposed to provide some kind of robustness to allow secret shared values to be opened reliably, okay, at least with a board. Okay, so when we're running the SPDZ protocol in the online phase, whenever parties have opened some value x by reconstructing the shares, then at some point you'll have to do a mag check to ensure that this reconstruction was done properly. And the way this works from the 2013 paper is to run this commit and open protocol, which is designed specifically so that you can check the MAC without having to reveal the MAC key, so that you can continue using the MAC key for future computations. So here we have the two-party setting, where Alice and Bob will each compute some value zi, which is their MAC key share minus the open value x times by their share of the MAC key. And then they'll run this commit and open phase and reconstruct both of the zi's and check that they sum to give 0. So if you remember the MAC equation, then in the honest case, these gammas sum to the MAC x times alpha, so we should get something that's 0 if the parties behave honestly. And if they cheat, on the other hand, and x is incorrectly open, then it turns out that to forge this protocol, you kind of have to guess the MAC key, which should be hard. Okay, so what could go wrong with this MAC check? Well, it turns out there's a slight quirk, which turns out to be a bit leaky, which I'll illustrate with this simple two-party example. So where Alice is now corrupted. And let's suppose that in the opening phase, instead of sending the correct share, she just sends her share -1. So we reconstruct x -1. And now in the checking phase, let's say Alice and Bob will both commit to their ZI values as before, computed now using the new X prime value. And you can see that when we reconstruct these, Bob opens his share Z2, and now Alice will actually not send an opening to her commitment because she doesn't want Bob to abort the protocol. She will at this point just kind of stall and leave Bob hanging for a little bit. But then she can reconstruct Z1 plus Z2, and we'll actually reconstruct the MAC key alpha. Because of this, X is now X minus 1, we have a difference of alpha. So on the one hand, they seem kind of bad, right? This key is supposed to be secret. But on the other hand, if Alice tries to do anything and continue the protocol, then Bob will just abort. So it seems like maybe nothing can go wrong. But this depends a little bit on what happens in the implementations. So thinking hypothetically still, we can imagine a situation where the online phase is done in a multi-threaded setting. So we have 2 threads running the online phase independently, but assume that they both share the same pre-processing material used in speeds, and in particular the same MAC key. Then we can have an output in the first thread, which has a MAC check protocol, where Alice can cheat in the MAC check protocol and learn the MAC key, and hang thread 1, and then pass this over to thread 2, and use this to cheat in an opening of some value x, and then basically change this to whatever she wants, and use the key to forge the MAC check, so it looks like everything goes fine in that thread. So if this issue were to be present, then you could, of course, violate output integrity of the protocol by changing outputs to whatever you want. You can sometimes also violate input privacy because, of course, if you have a protocol where outputs can depend on each other, then you can end up with these input-dependent errors, which might also, in turn, leak information on the private inputs. OK, so how does it look for the implementations we studied? So we looked at the 3 frameworks. The first 2, MP Speeds and Scale Mamba, based on a common code base of the Bristol Speeds implementation, which has a C++ backend implementing various different kinds of MPC protocols together with a Python-like front-end compiler to translate the high-level programs into an intermediate representation that's executed by the C++. And these frameworks exploit parallelism on 2 different levels. So firstly, the Python compiler does some optimizations to reorder instructions and parallelize communication. But this isn't really about multi-threading, so that's kind of orthogonal to this issue. But then secondly, the compiler allows users to specify that certain parts of the program will be executed in multiple threads. And this is kind of left up to the user to do safely, and also kind of independent of the protocol. Fresco, on the other hand, is a purely Java-based framework where users specify their programs in Java, and this is directly executed by the Java virtual machine. And Fresco also has a limited form of multi-threading where you can define certain blocks of computation to be run in parallel, but this is a bit more restrictive than the Python one. For instance, it doesn't allow output commands to be parallelized. So how does it look? Well, it turns out MP Speeds and Scale Mamba were, at least before being patched, both susceptible to this issue. Exactly because when you have multi-threading in these frameworks, the openings and all the MAC checks were done completely independently, so you could kind of stall one and then use the MAC key in the other and carry out this attack. Fresco, on the other hand, was not susceptible, purely because of its more restricted multi-threading model, where the MAC checks are all carried out kind of globally and not independently. OK, so along the way in looking at these frameworks, we also uncovered a few other bugs. So the first one I'll talk about here is to do with implementing hash-based commitments. So a textbook example of a commitment scheme is to hash the message together with some randomness, right, to commit to a message X. Most people think of this as a secure commitment scheme, but it's actually not composable and secure in a setting where you have multiple parties talking to each other. And the reason for this is that it's kind of trivially susceptible to replay attacks if you don't include any domain separation information in the hash function, like here. And it turns out that when you plug this into many kind of MPC protocols, which use a classic commit and open protocol for coin tossing, then you can force a coin tossing protocol to output 0, which, surprise, surprise, leads to more things breaking and is not very random. So other issues we found are mostly related to missing MAC checks. So in some cases, there were kind of secret values which were passed from one thread to another and not checked in the right place. Another case with missing MAC checks in truncation protocols or comparison protocols where you have to open a masked input, so open some X value masked with a random value R, where it kind of looks like you might not need to check the MAC on this immediately because you're just opening random values, but in some cases, if you don't check the MAC, this can actually lead to some information leakage, and you really need to do this. And finally, another potential pitfall with these implementations is that if you ever run into an abort in your protocol, then of course the MAC key might have leaked, and now you need to throw away all of your preprocessing material and start again from scratch. Many times this is kind of left up to the user, which maybe isn't the best way to go. And even in some cases, we found that, okay, if you do restart the preprocessing protocol, it would actually reuse the same MAC key that was stored from the previous execution. So it would lead to exactly the same problem. Okay, so yeah, that's the class of attacks that we discovered. I'll now pass over to Sabina to say a bit more about these and countermeasures.
So, how do I... Okay. Oh, thank you, Peter, for the introduction of the attacks. Before I talk more about countermeasures, let me just quickly recap what the attacks were. So we have this table. On the left-hand side, you see all the attacks that Peter talked about. And there's a column per framework, and you can see which framework is susceptible to this attack. And I've also grouped them by the type of attack. So the first two I would call concurrency attacks because they only appear in like a concurrent implementation. We have the insecure commitment scheme, which leads to a replay attack, and then we have like missing MAC checks, MAC key issues. Yeah, as you can see, Fresco is only susceptible to this, or like Fresco implemented these hash-based commitment schemes in an insecure way. And for MP suites and Scamamba, we see that they're vulnerable to pretty much all of the attacks except for the commitment scheme one. We have disclosed all of those, and they have all been patched as far as we're aware, except for the Scamamba ones. And as far as we're aware, Scamamba is currently not being maintained. Now, I promised to talk about countermeasures. What can you do? There are some very kind of simple, I would call them bugs here on the slide. So if you missed a MAC check, don't miss the MAC check. That is the countermeasure. If you're using a MAC key after an abort, don't do that. And it's the same for the unchecked byte memory. That's also a missing MAC check at its core. For the commitment scheme issue, use a different commitment scheme or use domain separation. But then there's one more left, which is this MAC key leakage attack. What do we do about that one? Right. So at its core, we have the MAC key leakage property, which is a property of the speeds protocol design, and then that leads to an attack. So we can deal with it at different levels, either at the level of the implementation or at the level of the protocol design. At the level of the implementation, again, we have a very simple solution, which is don't allow multi-threading. Then nothing can go wrong. Then the protocol just aborts if there's a MAC key leakage, then we're good. But if we still want the efficiency, if we still want multi-threading, we need to be careful and use some synchronization. So the issue really appears if you start one MAC check, and then don't wait until this MAC check passes before you do another MAC check. So you need to make sure that there's synchronization between MAC checks, either by enforcing like a sequential execution of MAC checks, the rest can still be parallelized, or as Fresco did, perform just all MAC checks in a main thread, for example. There's just one thread which is allowed to do MAC checks. If we're looking at the protocol design level, that means you can use a countermeasure which is modifying the protocol design, basically. And in the paper, we describe two possible options here. One is to switch to a different MAC scheme. The issue here is that everything uses the same MAC key. So if you leak the MAC key, you're done. So if you use some kind of authenticated secret sharing that uses some MAC where you use different MAC keys, that should work better. And another option they're proposing in the paper is a new MAC check protocol that is actually a masked MAC check protocol. So before you do the MAC check, you randomize your MAC key, and then you run the MAC check protocol. the idea here is that the protocol can still leak this masked MAC key, but now you're losing the masked MAC key and not the MAC key itself. But as I said, those are all protocol modifications. All right, now we have a bit of an elephant in the room. We have a security analysis here, but also we have these attacks. So to go back to our gap between theory and practice, we're in a world where the theory people say, Speeds is UC secure. And on the practical side, we have seen now that Speeds is maybe not secure. So what is going on here? I mean, and this holds for maybe you can think Speeds, the protocol design as well, because we have this MAC key leakage. What is this thing? So the way I think about it is that you can ask the question, what is really Speeds? So I don't know, I come from a theory side, and on the side, we think about this as like, we have a protocol design and then someone implements it, but it's still the same protocol fundamentally. But I would argue that is not necessarily the case, because you have to make adaptations to the protocol in some way. So I think of this as like, there are at least two versions of Speeds here at play. One is sequential Speeds, which is the protocol design on paper that was analyzed in UC, and that one is still secure. We have a UC security analysis, and even in the presence of this MAC key leakage, that's not a problem, because the protocol will just abort at that point. So we still have UC security. But then with a modification that a protocol, that an implementation makes to the protocol, we get what I would call something like concurrent Speeds. And here, there are actually multiple versions of it, because depending on the type of multi-threading and the type of synchronization that the implementers have introduced, you get technically different versions of Speeds. So I would say there are multiple concurrent versions of Speeds. Now I want to say one thing about concurrency here, because concurrency is an overloaded term here. We talk a lot about concurrent security in the MPC space, and what that really means is concurrency in the sense of distributed systems, where we're talking about message interleaving. But we also have a dimension here, which is multi-threading, node-local concurrency. And in this type of MPC implementations, you're dealing with both at the same time, and our security models do not capture that right now. Right, so a more accurate version of this gap would be, on the theory side, we know that sequential Speeds is UC secure, and on the practical side, we have concurrent Speeds is maybe secure or maybe not, depending on what you mean by concurrent Speeds. So my takeaway here on the security analysis side is that the Speeds protocol design has some property, this MAC key leakage, that seems to be completely benign if you execute it in a sequential way, but it does not play well with multi-threading. And our usual security analysis does not flag that. We have no way of checking that this is the case. How do we deal with that when we go to an implementation where for an implementer this leakage is an issue? Do we just expect them to see that that's the case when our security analysis says nothing about that? Okay. Yes. Okay, I can say one more thing here. I was saying our security analysis does not capture that. What we actually did is try to capture some aspects of that to the extent that we could in a new JUC model, where we could show that some form of concurrent Speeds, like a very limited version of concurrency, is actually still secure, and we could show that this masked MAC check protocol is actually secure in this setting. But it would be interesting to see like more refined models here. Right. So to conclude, what we've seen in this talk and with this work is we looked at security of concurrent Speeds implementations. We showed that the Speeds protocol has a previously unknown MAC key leakage property, and this like MAC key leakage means that the entire MAC key is leaked, and the adversary can trigger like when this happens, always. There are no conditions to that. And this MAC key leakage can lead to attacks, as we've showed. It did lead to an attack on MP Speeds and also on Scale Mamba. So in the paper we show how we can actually exploit this, but Peter explained how it works in principle. And more generally, would like to attention to the fact that existing security models have just limitations with respect to this type of concurrency. They do not capture that at all. We have made some attempts at capturing aspects of it, but it would be interesting to see how we can capture that better. Another aspect here is like this tension between theory and practice. So when people implement protocols, they necessarily have to deviate from the papers because we're just not specifying all the details. And right now there's an element to it of the implementer is expected to understand the implications of their deviations and justify that. Maybe that's something we want, but in an ideal world, maybe we should have better models that capture some of those aspects. And finally, we have a question for the community, and that is whether it would make sense to collect like best practices for implementations, implementation security, to at least, avoid the obvious bugs and things. If you want to learn more, this work is going to be presented at SMP, and also we will have an ePrint version soon. Yes, and else we're happy to take questions. Thank you.
Okay. Question?
Yeah, maybe also a suggestion, and please correct me if I have understood it incorrectly, because you say it's not, or speeds is not secure if you have concurrency, and then you say you should avoid multi-threading. But also I can have a single thread on which I scheduled multiple tasks concurrently, and also that would not be allowed. So I think you have to extend your warning, not just to not do multi-threading, but also not do, say, cooperative multitasking on a single thread, because that's still insecure, I guess.
Yes,
Yeah.
good point.
Yeah, to slightly expand on what that was just said, it needs a scope setting, so what you cannot do with a single Mac key, for example. So do I understand correctly? There's somebody who puts data into an MPC system, and somehow, okay, there's some folks that put data in the MPC system, and then someone invokes a speeds instance that runs a computation under MPC on those protocols in one or more threads. So if you do this in more than one thread, then then there's an attack, right? But if, for example, there's some Roseman or whoever have implemented something where there's a second instance of an MP speeds protocol running on a different thread, possibly with separate MAC keys, then that is not the same attacker model, right? So it's not like multi-threading isn't evil inherently evil. The point is that how you use it again. So there's some definitions and modeling to be done here. Excellent work otherwise. So happy that there's also now, in addition to the TEs are broken, there's now also MPCs broken.
Yeah, I mean, do you want to?
Sure, maybe I can just highlight one thing is that, if you have this multi-threaded setting with completely independent speeds instances, then this is something that's, of course, captured by UC security because, it's just composing one protocol with itself using independent resources.
So then don't do multi-threading is not the correct answer.
No.
Yes. I mean, I hope the takeaway was not don't do multi-threading, but more like maybe we should think about a protocol design and how it interacts with multi-threading so that we can get the best of both worlds.
Thank you for your talk. Do you have any suggestions on how to model concurrency from the ground up to make it properly?
Ooh. That's a tricky question. Maybe we can talk offline. I mean, it sounds a bit too big in scope for a quick answer.
Maybe next year's talk.
Hey, very nice talk. I have something that maybe goes a little bit further for like a Dan's question. Isn't this at its core an issue of like implementers not understanding UC security? Because if you speeds is concurrently secure. You have two instances. They of course use different MAC keys. UC says exactly that the right MAC key is not going to come jumping out from some random place. So isn't maybe this solution, and also if you have this masked MAC check, which I like very much, but if you look at it from a UC perspective, it's just like a defense in depth. It doesn't really add anything to the security of the speech protocol if you look at it not with in mind that people are going to implement this incorrectly, right? It's a hedge against incorrect implementation. So I don't know maybe what is the right approach here? Is it to make implementers understand UC, or is it to make UC people, add extra measures in case somebody messes up. And I guess like to predict how people might mess up in implementations.
So firstly, on the understanding UC part, so in the one sense you're right, but if you take this to the extreme and say, okay, implementers can only implement the protocol exactly as modeled originally, then it means you can't even do like 2 multiplications in parallel in the same thread. Because the protocol wasn't written this way. And okay, you could rewrite the protocol to handle this, but that's kind of tedious and no one bothered to do that. So it's kind of up to the implementer to understand, okay, where is it safe to do the multi-threading and where is it not? Right. And that's the challenge.
Maybe one more question.
Thank you for the very nice talk, very useful work. I think also in relation to Anna's question and your comments and all of this, I think like a general guideline, like having, similar to OWASP, having a checklist for MPC implementations would be extremely useful, because there's also, as you mentioned, with the gap of theory and practice, there's also like a lot of time in papers where things kind of get abstracted away. Like say, if you actually need different hash functions and different settings in a paper, you just use one hash function there and don't worry about it and don't mention it. The same with domain separation is typically also something that you never see anywhere in any paper. So like personally, I have a little list of pitfalls I've collected through the years, which I think could make a nice start to a list, because I think like theoreticians are going to do theory, practitioners are going to do practice, and there's going to be things overlooked between those two. So any kind of like MPC checklist where the common pitfalls are, such as like, and beware with the concurrency that you don't interleave steps of the protocol. Beware of the domain separation, like IDs in UC messages, like these kind of things. There's like just a bunch of, not that many, but just a bunch of small check marks to go through. I think that would be useful for everyone.
I think that's a great idea, and I think also the MPC alliances would be interested in that too. You should talk to us. But we're eating into our lunchtime, so let's please thank all of our speakers for this session.